The organ music swelled, then faltered, then began again for the third time. A nervous cough echoed through the cavernous silence of the church. Outside the heavy oak doors of the bridal waiting room, 300 guests were whispering. Natalie Parker heard their murmurs through the wood, each one a tiny poisoned dart. I heard he got cold feet. Poor girl. Can you imagine? Jilted at the altar? She stood in her magnificent wedding gown, a cloud of white tulle and shattered dreams, and felt a cold, creeping dread snake its way up her spine. Her fiancé, Mark, was late. An hour late. Her father, his face pale and strained in his tuxedo, paced the small antechamber. "I'm sure it's just traffic, sweetheart. He'll be here." But his words were hollow, and they both knew it. He squeezed her hand one last time before slipping out a side door. "I'll go find out what's happening." Left alone, the silence in the small room was deafening. Natalie's phone, clutched in her trembling hand, vibrated. A new message. From Mark. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened it. The words on the screen were simple, brutal, and utterly final. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." The world tilted. The air rushed from her lungs. The phone slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the stone floor. A strangled sob escaped her lips, a raw, wounded sound. She collapsed into a velvet armchair, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs, the carefully applied waterproof mascara finally surrendering, tracing black rivers down her cheeks. It was over. Her life, her future, her heart, all shattered by a single, cowardly text message. The door to the waiting room creaked open. She expected it to be her father, returning with a face full of pity. But it wasn't. It was a guest, a man she barely recognized from the periphery of her life. He was tall, with a shock of dark red hair, and eyes the most startling shade of blue she had ever seen. He wore his expensive suit with a casual, almost dangerous grace. Dr. Michael Harrington, a brilliant, enigmatic neurosurgeon from the hospital where her father served on the board. They had been introduced once, briefly, at a fundraiser. He must have heard the rumors, the whispers that had spread through the waiting congregation like wildfire. He closed the heavy door behind him, encasing them in a sudden, profound cocoon of silence. He didn't speak. He simply walked over to her, his expression serious, his gaze holding an unexpected, unnerving gentleness. He knelt in front of her chair, bringing him to her eye level. The scent of expensive cologne and clean, sterile soap clung to him. "They're waiting for a wedding, Miss Parker," he said, his voice a low, calm murmur that cut through her haze of grief. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears, her mind reeling in confusion. "What?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "A wedding," he repeated, his blue eyes holding hers. "And I propose we give them one." Natalie stared at him, the bizarre, insane words hanging in the air between them. She was sure she was hallucinating, that the shock and grief had finally fractured her mind. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, wiping at her tear-streaked face with a trembling hand. "Your fiancé is a coward," Michael continued, his voice steady and firm, devoid of pity, but filled with a strange, compelling logic. "He chose to humiliate you in the most public way imaginable. But your dignity does not have to be another casualty of his weakness today." He glanced toward the heavy oak doors, as if he could see the 300 guests waiting on the other side. "There are people out there who flew across the country to see you happy. Your family, your friends, they are waiting to celebrate you. I can be the groom they see." The sheer audacity of the proposal was breathtaking. "Why?" she whispered, the question raw and desperate. "Why would you possibly do that?" A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, a shadow in the depths of his blue eyes. "Perhaps I need a miracle of my own today," he answered enigmatically. "Or perhaps," he added, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly, "I simply cannot abide the sight of a good heart being crushed for sport." He held out his hand. It was a surgeon's hand, strong, steady, and capable. "The choice is yours, Natalie," he said, using her first name for the first time, the sound of it in his low voice both intimate and jarring. "You can walk out that door and be remembered as the bride who was abandoned at the altar, or you can walk out as Mrs. Harrington." She looked at his outstretched hand, then at the closed doors. She imagined the whispers, the pitying looks, the triumphant smirk on the face of Mark's new girlfriend, who was undoubtedly a guest in the crowd. She thought of her father, of the shame and pain this would cause him. The humiliation was a tidal wave, threatening to drown her. Michael's offer was a lifeline, a crazy, impossible, terrifying lifeline. But it was the only one she had. In a moment of pure, unadulterated desperation, she made a choice. She chose defiance over despair. She chose to save herself. She placed her trembling hand in his. "Okay," she whispered, the single word sealing her fate. A slow, satisfied nod was his only response. He rose to his feet, gently pulling her up with him. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a crisp, white linen handkerchief. With a surprising, almost clinical tenderness, he carefully dabbed at the tear tracks on her cheeks, his touch light and impersonal, yet incredibly intimate. He leaned in close, his lips brushing against her ear, his warm breath a ghost against her skin. He whispered the 5 words that would change her life forever. "Pretend to marry me now." He then turned and pulled open the heavy oak doors. The first triumphant notes of the wedding march swelled, flooding the small room. The entire congregation, which had been murmuring in anticipation of a cancellation, fell into a stunned, collective silence. He offered her his arm, his expression once again a mask of cool, unreadable confidence. "Ready, wife?" he murmured, a dangerous glint in his blue eyes. Together, they stepped out of the shadows and into the bright, unforgiving light of the church, walking toward the altar and into the heart of the most beautiful, terrifying lie she had ever told. The walk down the aisle was the longest 10 yards of Natalie's life. A wave of audible gasps and frantic whispers followed them like the train of her wedding gown. She kept her eyes fixed on the altar, not daring to look at the sea of shocked, confused faces. She could feel the solid, reassuring presence of Michael at her side, his arm linked with hers, a steady anchor in the storm of her own making. At the front of the church, her father stood, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. He looked from his daughter to the strange, powerful man at her side, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. As they reached him, Michael leaned in and spoke to him, his voice too low for anyone else to hear. "Trust me," he said, a simple, firm command. He gave a slight nod, a gesture of reassurance that seemed, impossibly, to calm her father's panic. They arrived at the altar, where the officiant, a kindly, elderly man, was looking at them over the top of his spectacles, as if they had both grown a second head. "There's been a change of plans," Michael said to him, his voice low but radiating an authority that brooked no argument. "Proceed with the ceremony." The officiant, flustered but clearly intimidated, fumbled with his book and cleared his throat. The rest of the ceremony was a surreal blur. When the time came for the vows, Natalie's mind went blank. She had spent months memorizing the promises she had written for Mark, and now they were ashes in her mouth. Michael, sensing her panic, gave her hand a slight, reassuring squeeze. He turned to her, and when he spoke, his voice was clear, steady, and filled with a shocking, breathtaking sincerity. "I, Michael," he began, his blue eyes locked on hers, "take you, Natalie, to be my wife. I promise to honor you, to protect you from all harm, and to be your safe harbor from this day forward. In the face of uncertainty, I will be your strength. In the face of sorrow, I will be your comfort. This I vow to you." It was a masterpiece of improvisation, words so perfect, so fitting for their bizarre situation. that they sounded more real than any pre-written verse. Now it was her turn. She took a shaky breath, looking into the eyes of the stranger who had just saved her. "I, Natalie," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear, "take you, Michael, to be my husband. I promise to trust in your strength, to accept your protection, and to stand by your side today and for all the days to come." The officiant, still looking utterly bewildered, finally stammered, "Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The world seemed to fall away. It was just the two of them, standing at the altar, the weight of their public lie hanging between them. Michael turned to her. He reached out with both hands and gently, reverently lifted her veil, his fingers brushing against her cheeks. "Just for a moment," he whispered, his voice a husky murmur meant only for her. And then he kissed her. It was not the chaste, polite peck she had expected, a simple sealing of their performance. It was a kiss that was deep and slow and shockingly possessive. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, holding her in place as his lips moved against hers with a practiced, devastating confidence. It was a kiss that sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity through her, silencing every thought in her head, every fear in her heart. It was a kiss that felt like a claim, a brand, a promise. He pulled away slowly, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't decipher. He took her hand, his grip firm and warm. "Come on, wife," he murmured, his voice a low, possessive growl. He turned and led her back down the aisle, through the sea of stunned, silent guests. They walked out of the church and into the bright sunlight, leaving behind the chaos, the confusion, and a beautiful, terrifying mystery that had only just begun. The heavy doors of the black limousine closed with a soft, definitive thud, encasing them in a cocoon of silent, leather-scented luxury. The roar of the confused crowd and the frantic clicking of cameras were instantly muted, leaving only the soft hum of the engine and the sound of their own breathing. The moment they were hidden from the world, the mask of the confident, adoring groom fell away from Michael. He leaned back against the seat, running a hand through his dark red hair, and the cool, commanding surgeon returned. He looked at her, his expression now serious, his blue eyes filled with a genuine clinical concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice losing its performative warmth. The adrenaline that had carried Natalie through the surreal ceremony began to drain away, leaving a hollow, aching void in its place. The full, crushing reality of her situation, jilted at the altar, humiliated in front of everyone she knew, and now married to a powerful, enigmatic stranger, crashed down on her. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears. But then her composure crumbled. It wasn't a loud, hysterical breakdown. It was a quiet, heartbreaking surrender. Silent tears began to trace paths through her flawless makeup, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the day's trauma. Michael didn't touch her. He didn't offer platitudes or empty comforts. He simply reached into his suit jacket, pulled out another crisp linen handkerchief, and placed it in her hand. He then turned his gaze to the window, giving her the dignity of space, the quiet respect of letting her grieve without an audience. She cried for what felt like an eternity, mourning the future she had lost and terrified of the one she had just entered. When her tears finally subsided, leaving her feeling empty and exhausted, he finally spoke again. "I didn't do that just for you," he admitted, his voice calm and direct. He was all business now. "I had my own reasons." She looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed and questioning. "I, too, am in need of a wife," he explained, his tone matter-of-fact. "My family, and more importantly, the board of directors at the hospital where I am vying for the position of chief of surgery, have been pressuring me to settle down. They see marriage as a sign of stability, of maturity. A sudden whirlwind romance with a woman I rescued from public humiliation. It's the perfect narrative. It's unexpected, it's romantic, and it effectively silences all their concerns, and ends my mother's relentless matchmaking." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "I am proposing a formal arrangement. We maintain this charade for 1 year. We present a united, convincing front to the world. At the end of the year, we will have a quiet, amicable divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Everyone moves on." It was a cold, calculated business proposal, delivered with the precision of a surgeon outlining a procedure. "And in return?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "In return," he said, "I will provide you with complete financial security for the duration of our marriage. A generous allowance, a place to live, a way to disappear from the public eye until this scandal dies down and you can start fresh. It is a mutually beneficial transaction." The offer was both an insult and a lifeline. He was offering to pay her to be his wife, but he was also offering her a way out of the nightmare. "Why me?" she asked again, the question that had been haunting her. "You could have anyone. Why choose a complete stranger in the middle of a crisis?" He was silent for a moment, his gaze analytical, as if he were solving a complex puzzle. "Because you were a variable I could not have predicted, and therefore, the most believable choice. No one would ever suspect this was planned. And," he added, his voice dropping slightly, "because for a split second, in that waiting room, before the tears came, I saw the look in your eyes. You weren't just heartbroken. You were a fighter. You looked like the bravest person I had ever seen." He leaned forward slightly. "So, do we have a deal, Mrs. Harrington?" The use of her new name was a shock, a cold splash of water that sealed the bizarre reality of her situation. She was no longer Natalie Parker, the abandoned bride. She was Mrs. Harrington, the wife of a billionaire stranger, a partner in the most important performance of her life. She took a deep breath and met his intense, waiting gaze. "We have a deal." The limousine pulled into the underground garage of a sleek, modern skyscraper that pierced the city skyline like a shard of glass. Michael's penthouse was a silent, sprawling fortress on the top floor, a world of polished concrete, minimalist furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed the glittering city below like a conquered kingdom. Natalie was still in her wedding dress. The magnificent gown, which had felt like a symbol of hope and love just that morning, now felt like an absurd, heavy costume. She felt like a museum piece, displaced and out of time, standing in the middle of his cold, impersonal living room. "Let me show you to your room," Michael said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, empty space. He led her down a long, white corridor to a set of double doors. "The East Wing," he explained. "Your suite is here. It has its own living area, bathroom, and study. You will have complete privacy." He paused, then added, "My own suite is in the West Wing, at the opposite end of the penthouse." The unspoken message was clear. This was a shared space, but not a shared life. He walked into the suite with her. It was beautiful, of course, decorated in muted tones of gray and cream, but it had the impersonal, untouched feel of a luxury hotel room. "We need to establish some rules," he said, turning to face her, his expression all business. "For this arrangement to work, there must be absolute clarity." He began to pace slowly, his hands in his pockets. "Rule number 1. Separate lives. In this house, we are business partners. We do not pry. We do not intrude. The East Wing is your domain. The West Wing is mine." He stopped and looked at her. "Rule number 2. A flawless public performance. In public, we are a devoted, loving couple. You will smile. You will hold my hand. You will look at me as if I am the center of your universe. Your performance must be impeccable. The success of this arrangement depends on it." He started pacing again. "And rule number 3, the most important rule of all, no questions about the past. My life before today is not your concern, and yours is not mine. Our story begins with our wedding. Anything before that is irrelevant." The rules were cold, clinical, and designed to build an impenetrable wall between them. He was making it clear that while she would wear his name, she would never truly be a part of his life. "Do you understand?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I understand," she whispered, her throat tight. "Good." He looked at her, at the magnificent, complicated wedding dress she was still wearing. A flicker of something, annoyance, sympathy, crossed his face. "You'll need help with that," he stated, his tone practical. He walked behind her. "Turn around." She did as she was told, her back to him, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. She heard him take a breath, and then she felt his hands, cool and steady, at the top of her spine. Her dress had a row of what felt like 100 tiny, silk-covered buttons, an impossible task to manage on her own. With a practiced clinical efficiency, he began to undo them, one by one. His touch was impersonal, the detached movements of a surgeon, but the intimacy of the act was suffocating. His knuckles brushed against her bare skin, and a jolt of electricity, sharp and unexpected, shot through her. She flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement. His hand stilled for a fraction of a second. He said nothing. He simply continued, his movements perhaps a little faster now, a little less steady. She could feel the warmth of his body behind her, could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne. The silence in the room was deafening, filled only by the soft pop of each button being released. When he reached the last button at the small of her back, his fingers grazed her skin one final time. The spark was undeniable, a silent acknowledgement of an attraction that had no place in their cold, calculated arrangement. He stepped back abruptly, the spell broken. "Good night, Natalie," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. He turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving her standing in the middle of the luxurious suite, her body still tingling from the ghost of his touch. She was terrified and intrigued, and utterly alone with the enigmatic stranger she had just married. The first true test of their arrangement came 3 days later, in the form of a formal dinner invitation delivered on thick, cream-colored cardstock. It was a summons. Michael's mother, Eleanor Harrington, demanded an audience with her son and his bride. "My mother does not approve of surprises," Michael warned her as they prepared to leave that evening. He stood in the doorway of her suite, watching as she fastened a pair of diamond earrings he had provided. "She is a formidable woman. She will be looking for any weakness, any sign that this is not what it appears to be. Do not give her one." The Harrington family estate was a sprawling old money mansion that made Michael's modern penthouse feel like a sterile laboratory. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and inherited power. Eleanor Harrington was exactly as formidable as Michael had described. She was a woman of severe elegance, with eyes as sharp and blue as her son's, and a smile that never quite reached them. Michael's younger sister, Chloe, was also there, a younger, more petulant version of her mother, her eyes filled with open skepticism and disdain. The dinner was a polite, brutal interrogation. "So, Natalie," Eleanor began, her voice smooth as silk, but with an underlying edge of steel. "Michael tells us so little about his life. Tell me, how did you two meet? It all seems so, sudden." Natalie's heart pounded. This was it, the first performance. She looked across the table at Michael, who gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "It was at a charity event a few months ago," Natalie began, reciting the backstory they had hastily concocted. "I was there with a friend. Michael was very charming." "Charming is not a word I typically associate with my son," Chloe chimed in, a small, cruel smile on her lips. "He's more of the brooding and emotionally unavailable type." "Chloe," Michael warned, his voice low. The questions continued, each one a carefully aimed dart. They asked about her family, her job. They had created a cover story of her being a freelance art consultant, their whirlwind romance. Natalie answered each one as best she could, feeling like a witness being cross-examined. The final, most dangerous question came from Eleanor. "Tell me, dear," she said, leaning forward slightly. "My son is a very powerful, very wealthy man. He could have any woman he wants. What is it, exactly, that made you fall in love with him so quickly?" The question was a trap. Any answer that sounded materialistic or superficial would confirm their suspicions. The silence stretched. Natalie felt Michael's gaze on her, waiting. She didn't recite a rehearsed line. Instead, she thought of the man at the altar, the man who had seen her at her lowest, most humiliated moment. She turned to Eleanor, her own gaze direct and surprisingly steady. "On the day we decided to get married," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I was having the worst day of my life. I felt small and invisible and completely alone." She then looked at Michael, her expression softening with a genuine, unfeigned emotion. "And your son didn't see a broken, pathetic girl. He saw someone worth saving. He showed me kindness when I expected none, and he gave me strength when I had none of my own." She looked back at Eleanor. How could I not fall in love with a man like that? The room was silent. Her answer, so raw, so vulnerable, and so deeply, unexpectedly honest, had completely disarmed them. Chloe looked down at her plate, for once without a snide remark. Eleanor's mask of cool appraisal faltered, a flicker of grudging respect in her eyes. And Michael. Michael was staring at her, his expression one of utter, profound shock. He had expected a performance, a well-delivered lie. He had not expected a truth that cut right to the heart of what had happened between them. Later that night, as they stood in the silent foyer of the penthouse, he finally spoke. "You did well tonight," he said, his voice unusually soft. "I wasn't lying," she replied quietly, not looking at him. "You were kind." The silence that fell between them was different this time. It was not a silence of tension or of rules. It was a silence heavy with the weight of a truth that neither of them was ready to acknowledge, that her performance had been real, and it had moved him more than he could ever have anticipated. The weeks following the family dinner settled into a strange new rhythm. Their public performances became more natural, their private interactions less strained. The memory of her heartfelt confession at the dinner table was an unspoken presence between them, a truth that had subtly redrawn the lines of their arrangement. The outside world, however, had not forgotten the scandal of Natalie's first, failed wedding. Mark, her ex-fiancé, had been in a state of shock and disbelief. The woman he had so casually discarded had not faded into obscurity as he had expected. Instead, she had been spectacularly, impossibly caught by the city's most eligible and powerful bachelor. His ego was bruised, his social standing diminished. He had gone from being the man who dumped Natalie Parker to the fool who let Mrs. Michael Harrington get away. Consumed by a toxic mixture of regret and wounded pride, he decided he had to see her. He had to get her back. He showed up at Montgomery General Hospital one afternoon, using his old familiarity with Natalie's family to get past the front desk. He demanded to see his fiancée, Natalie, causing a scene in the pristine marble lobby. The head of security, alerted to the disturbance, called Michael's office directly. "Dr. Harrington," the security chief said, his voice tense, "there is a man in the lobby demanding to see your wife. He's claiming to be her fiancé. His name is Mark." A cold, dangerous stillness fell over Michael's office. "Keep him there," he said, his voice a low, deadly calm. "I'm on my way." Natalie, who had been volunteering in the hospital's pediatric wing, a quiet act of charity she had insisted on, was alerted by a nurse that she had a visitor. Confused, she made her way to the lobby. She saw Mark before he saw her, and her blood ran cold. Just as she was about to turn and flee, Michael appeared, seemingly from nowhere, intercepting her. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice a low, protective growl. He walked toward Mark, his stride long and confident, a predator approaching a lesser animal on his territory. "Mark," Michael said, his voice deceptively mild. "I believe you're lost." Harrington, Mark sneered, trying to project a confidence he clearly didn't feel. I'm here to see my fiancée. This has nothing to do with you. That's where you're mistaken, Michael replied, stopping a few feet from him. His voice dropped, losing all its warmth, becoming a blade of ice. Everything that concerns Natalie concerns me. The woman you publicly humiliated and abandoned at the altar is now my wife. She carries my name. She has my protection. He took another step closer, his sheer presence making Mark flinch. So let me be perfectly clear. You will not contact her. You will not come near her or her family. You will not even breathe in her direction again. This is your first and only warning. He leaned in, his voice a barely audible, lethal whisper. My patience as a doctor is considerable. My patience as a husband is not. Disappear. Mark, pale and trembling, practically scrambled out of the hospital lobby, his arrogance completely shattered. Michael stood there for a moment, his back rigid, his hands clenched into fists. Then, he slowly turned to face Natalie, who had watched the entire exchange from a safe distance, her heart hammering in her chest. His expression softened as his eyes met hers, the cold fury replaced by a quiet, intense concern. Are you all right? She could only nod, speechless. She had seen him be charming, clinical, and even kind. But she had never seen this. She had never seen the raw, possessive, and utterly ferocious power he wielded to protect what he considered his. It was terrifying. And to her absolute horror, a part of her, a deep, primal part, found it devastatingly, irresistibly attractive. Michael's fierce defense of her in the hospital lobby became another unspoken secret between them, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of the shifting ground beneath their feet. He had protected her not as part of their contract, but with a raw, possessive instinct that had nothing to do with their business arrangement. The incident left Natalie feeling both unsettled and strangely deeply secure. She began to spend more time in the vast, quiet library of the penthouse. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in stories and escape the confusing reality of her own life. The library was clearly Michael's as well, though he rarely used it. It was filled with thousands of books, mostly medical texts and biographies of great leaders. But one section was different. It was a small, dusty shelf in the corner, filled with old high school and college yearbooks. One rainy afternoon, driven by a restless curiosity, she pulled one of them down. It was a leather-bound yearbook from Northgate Preparatory, a prestigious local high school, dated over a decade ago. She flipped through the pages, seeing the younger faces of the city's elite. And then she found him. A much younger Michael Harrington stared out from a group photo of the science club. His red hair was longer, his face thinner, but the intense, intelligent blue eyes were unmistakable. He looked serious, a little awkward, a world away from the powerful, confident man he was today. She smiled, a fond, private smile, and then her eyes drifted to the boy standing next to him. A boy with a wide, easy grin, his arm slung casually around Michael's shoulders. The name printed below the photo made her blood run cold. Leo Parker. The yearbook slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the polished floor. It couldn't be. Leo Parker was her older brother. Her brilliant, funny, beloved older brother, who had died in a car accident when she was just a girl, more than 10 years ago. An accident her family never, ever spoke about in detail. The grief, a silent, gaping wound that had never truly healed. Her hands trembled as she picked up the book again, staring at the photo. Michael and Leo, standing side by side, grinning, the very picture of teenage friendship. Her mind raced, a chaotic storm of questions. Michael had known her brother. He had never said a word. He had seen her at the wedding, heard her name, Natalie Parker, and had shown no sign of recognition. Rule number 3. No questions about the past. Suddenly felt less like a professional boundary and more like a sinister, deliberate wall. Was it possible? Was his rescue at the wedding, His sudden, impulsive decision to marry her, a complete stranger, really just a random act? Or was it something else? She frantically flipped through the yearbook, her heart pounding. She found another photo, this one a candid shot of the debate team. Michael and Leo were there again, laughing, heads close together as if sharing a secret. And in the background, almost out of focus, was a younger girl with long blonde hair, watching them with a look of adoration. A much younger Natalie Parker, who used to tag along with her big brother everywhere. He had known who she was, the whole time. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Their entire relationship, their chance encounter, their contract, all of it had been built on a foundation of lies far deeper than she could have ever imagined. She stood there in the silent library, the open yearbook in her hands, the smiling face of her dead brother looking up at her. The man she was falling in love with, the man who had saved her, was inextricably linked to the greatest tragedy of her life. And he had never said a word. The silence of the library was a roaring in Natalie's ears. She stood frozen, the yearbook open in her hands, the smiling face of her brother a ghostly accusation. The carefully constructed world she had been living in for the past few months shattered, the pieces falling around her like sharp, glittering shards of glass. He had known. The whole time he had known. A cold, hard anger, an anger born of a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical wound, began to burn through her shock. She closed the yearbook with a snap that echoed in the silent room and marched out of the library, her purpose a blade of ice in her heart. She found him in his study, reviewing a set of brain scans on a large, glowing monitor. He looked up as she entered, a flicker of surprise on his face at her abrupt entrance. She didn't say a word. She walked to his desk and slammed the yearbook down in front of him, the sound making him flinch. It was open to the page with the science club photo. "Who is this, Michael?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet, trembling with a barely suppressed rage. He looked down at the photo. The color drained from his face. His cool, professional mask crumbled, revealing a look of raw, panicked shock. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "Natalie, he began, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Don't!" She cut him off, her voice rising. "Don't you dare lie to me. Not anymore. You knew him. You knew my brother." He couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the photo, at the smiling face of the boy who had been his friend. "Yes," he admitted, the word barely audible. "And you knew who I was," she pressed on, her voice breaking. "At the wedding. You knew who I was, and you said nothing." "It was complicated," he stammered, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure desperation. The rules, she cried, a bitter, incredulous laugh escaping her lips. "You think this is about your stupid rules? This is about my brother. The brother I lost, the brother my family never recovered from. And you were a part of his life. A part you deliberately, cruelly, hid from me." She was circling the desk now, her body thrumming with a chaotic energy of grief and betrayal. Was this all some kind of game? Some sick, twisted tribute to him? Did you see me at that altar, pathetic and broken, and decide to save your best friend's little sister as some kind of cosmic good deed? No, it wasn't like that, he insisted, finally looking up at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "Then what was it like, Michael?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Tell me the truth. For once in this sham of a marriage, tell me the goddamn truth." He stood up, his own composure shattering. "You want the truth?" he said, his voice raw with a decade of unspoken grief. "Leo was my best friend. He was the only real friend I ever had, and I was with him the night he died." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. "What?" "I was in the car with him, Natalie," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I was in the passenger seat. I was there." The room spun. The man she had married, the man she was falling in love with, had been there. He had been there when her brother had taken his last breath. The foundation of her world, which had already been cracked, now disintegrated into dust. "What happened that night, Michael?" she whispered, her voice filled with a new, dawning horror. "What really happened to my brother?" The air in the study was thick with the ghosts of the past. Michael looked at Natalie, at the horror and dawning comprehension in her eyes, and knew that the time for secrets was over. The wall he had built around that night, the wall of silence and guilt he had maintained for over a decade, was about to come crashing down. He sank back into his chair, the strength seeming to drain from his body. "We were 17, he began, his voice a low, haunted murmur. "We thought we were invincible. We had just won the state debate championship. Leo was driving. We were on top of the world." He stared at a point on the far wall, his eyes seeing not his pristine office, but a dark, rain-slicked road from a lifetime ago. It was late. We were on our way back from a celebration party. We weren't drinking, we weren't speeding. We were just happy. He paused, taking a shaky breath. A car came out of nowhere. It ran a red light, doing at least 80. It was a black sedan. It hit us on the driver's side. He closed his eyes, the memory as vivid and brutal as if it had happened yesterday. There was a sound. A terrible sound of metal and glass. And then silence. "I woke up in the hospital a day later," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "A broken arm, a concussion, some cracked ribs. But I was alive. Leo was pronounced dead at the scene." Natalie listened, her body numb, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. "The police report," Michael said, his voice turning hard, "was a work of fiction. It said Leo had lost control of the car on the wet road. A tragic accident. A single-car incident. The other car, the black sedan, was never mentioned. It was as if it had never been there." "But you were there," Natalie whispered. "You saw it." "Yes," he said, a bitter self-loathing edge to his voice. "I saw it, and I told them. I told the police, I told my parents. I told anyone who would listen. But the man driving that other car was a ghost." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a decade of impotent rage. Except he wasn't a ghost. He was Judge Martin Wexler, a powerful, influential man with a long history of drunk driving offenses that had been quietly, repeatedly, swept under the rug. And that night, he wasn't just drunk. He was fleeing the scene of another crime. His son, Michael said, the name like poison on his tongue, had been at the same party as us. He had gotten into a fight, and Wexler was called to come and get him before the police arrived. He was driving drunk, with his son in the car, when he ran that red light and killed my best friend. The name of the son. Natalie's mind reeled, a terrible, sickening premonition dawning. "Who was his son, Michael?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael looked at her, his expression a mixture of pity and shared pain. "His son was Mark, your ex-fiancé." The world stopped. Mark, the man who was supposed to be standing at that altar. His father had killed her brother. The entire story of her life was a web of lies, a tangled, interconnected tragedy. "My family, my parents," she stammered. "Did they know?" "No," Michael said gently. "Wexler's influence was absolute. He and my father came to an agreement, a generous private settlement for my family to help with our grief, a promise that my confused, traumatized testimony would be disregarded. The official story was written, the case was closed, and the Parker family was told their son had died in a tragic accident. My father, to avoid a protracted, ugly war with a powerful man, agreed. He took the deal. He buried the truth to protect me, to protect our family's name." He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. "I became a doctor because of that night," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. to save the lives I couldn't save, to atone for a truth I was forced to bury. I have lived with that guilt, that secret, every single day for 10 years. He turned to face her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. When I saw you at that altar, so beautiful and so broken, being humiliated by the son of the man who killed your brother, I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let that family hurt your family again. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a strategy. It was an instinct, a debt. A promise I made to Leo a long time ago, to always look out for his little sister. She finally understood. Everything. The marriage wasn't a whim. It was a penance. It wasn't a rescue. It was an act of protection, a desperate, decade-late attempt to right an unforgivable wrong. She was in love with a man whose entire life had been shaped by the same tragedy that had shattered her own. Their pasts were not just connected, they were the same story, told from two different, painful perspectives. The confession left them in a state of raw, shared grief. The wall of secrets between them had been obliterated, replaced by a fragile, aching intimacy. They were no longer just a fake husband and wife. They were the two sole survivors of a tragedy that had defined both of their lives. But the world outside their penthouse sanctuary had not forgotten them. Mark, humiliated and discarded, was spiraling. He had lost Natalie. He had been publicly neutered by Michael, and his life was in shambles. Consumed by a bitter, vengeful rage, he decided that if he was going down, he wouldn't go down alone. He knew the one secret, the one piece of leverage he had left. The truth about his father and the accident. He didn't go to the police. That would implicate his own family. Instead, he went to the press. He contacted a notorious gossip columnist, a man known for his salacious stories and his complete lack of ethics. But Mark didn't tell the whole truth. He twisted it, crafting a new, more poisonous narrative. The story that broke online was a bombshell. Billionaire surgeon's dark secret. Did Dr. Harrington's deadly past lead to a wedding of lies? The article, quoting an anonymous but reliable source close to the family, painted a horrifying picture. It claimed that it was a young, reckless Michael Harrington who had been behind the wheel that night, and that his wealthy family had used their power and influence to pin the blame on the deceased Leo Parker. It suggested that Michael's sudden, bizarre marriage to the victim's sister, Natalie, was not a romance, but a calculated act of hush money, a way to buy the family's silence with wealth and status. The story was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. It took the core truths, the accident, the cover-up, the sudden marriage, and warped them into a narrative that made Michael the villain and Natalie his willing, complicit accomplice. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The hospital's board of directors was in an uproar. The media was in a frenzy. Michael's reputation, the one thing he had built with such meticulous care, was being torn to shreds. He was no longer the brilliant surgeon. He was the monster who had killed his best friend and bought the sister's silence. The public, hungry for a scandal, devoured the story. Natalie was painted as a gold digger, a woman who had sold her brother's memory for a place in high society. Their perfect romantic narrative, the one Michael had so carefully crafted, was now the very thing being used to destroy them. Michael was a man besieged, his career and his entire life hanging in the balance. The sins of his father and the lies he had been forced to keep had finally come back to claim him. The world became a prison. The penthouse, once a sanctuary, now felt like a besieged fortress. The media was camped outside, their cameras like vultures waiting for a kill. Every news channel, every gossip site, was running the story, each version more salacious and damning than the last. Michael was a ghost. He locked himself in his study, the weight of the public condemnation crushing him. He had spent his life building an empire of control and perfection, and now it was all crumbling, destroyed by a lie he hadn't even created. The hospital board convened an emergency ethics meeting to discuss his immediate suspension and the potential revocation of his medical license. His career was on the verge of being annihilated. His mother, Eleanor, arrived at the penthouse, her face a mask of cold fury. She didn't come to offer support. She came to demand damage control. "You must divorce her," she told Michael, her voice a blade of ice. "Immediately. You will issue a statement saying you were deceived, that you only just learned the truth about her connection to the accident. You will paint her as an opportunist who took advantage of your generosity. It's the only way to distance yourself from this, to save your career." Natalie, who had been standing in the doorway, heard every word. Her heart shattered. Even now, his mother's only concern was the family name, the preservation of their power. "No," Michael said, his voice a low, weary growl. "I will not throw her to the wolves." "Then you are a fool," Eleanor snapped. "She will be your ruin." The board meeting was scheduled for the following day. It was to be a closed-door hearing, a trial where Michael's fate would be decided. Everyone expected him to be destroyed. The narrative was too powerful, the scandal too great. That morning, as Michael prepared to leave for the hospital, looking like a man walking to his own execution, Natalie stopped him. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice quiet, but filled with a strength he hadn't heard since the day she had confronted him about her brother. "No, Natalie," he said, his voice full of a gentle, protective pain. "You don't need to be a part of this. I won't let them tear you apart." "You don't have a choice," she replied, her green eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering fire. "You made a vow to be my protector. Now it's my turn to be yours." She walked into the boardroom at his side, her head held high. The room was filled with a dozen stern-faced, judgmental board members. The air was thick with condemnation. The chairman began the proceedings, his voice grave. "Dr. Harrington, we are here to discuss the serious allegations that have been made against you." "Before you begin," Natalie interrupted, her voice clear and steady, commanding the attention of the entire room. "There is something you all need to hear." They all turned to look at her, surprised by her audacity. "My name is Natalie Parker," she began. "And yes, Leo Parker was my brother." She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the powerful men and women who were about to destroy the man she loved. "The story you have read is a lie," she said, "but it is wrapped around a terrible truth, a truth that has been buried for over a decade." And then, with a courage she didn't know she possessed, she told them everything. She told them about the real driver of the car that night, Judge Wexler. She told them about his son, Mark, her ex-fiancé. She told them about the cover-up, the deal her family had been forced to accept, the way the system had failed her brother. And then she told them about Michael. She told them about his guilt, his penance, his decade-long quest to honor his friend's memory. She told them how he had seen her at the altar, broken and humiliated by the son of the man who had killed her brother, and how he had stepped in, not as part of a conspiracy, but as an act of profound, desperate protection. "You have accused this man of buying my silence," she said, her voice ringing with a powerful, emotional truth. "You are wrong. He gave me back my voice. He gave my brother the justice he was denied. The man you see as a monster is the most honorable man I have ever known." She finished, her body trembling, her heart pounding. She had laid her family's deepest, most painful secrets bare to save him. She had chosen him, publicly, completely, and unconditionally. The boardroom was silent, the board members staring at her, their expressions a mixture of shock, awe, and dawning comprehension. She had not just defended him. She had rewritten the entire story. Natalie's testimony was a bombshell that obliterated the false narrative Mark had created. In the weeks that followed, the truth, now officially sanctioned by her public statement, came out. An internal investigation, spurred by the board, quietly confirmed the details of the cover-up. Judge Wexler, facing imminent disgrace, took an early retirement, and disappeared from public life. Mark and his family were ruined, their names synonymous with a scandal they could never escape. Michael's name was cleared. The board issued a public statement of their unwavering support for him, and he was unanimously voted in as the new chief of surgery. He was more powerful, more respected than ever before. He and Natalie became the city's most enigmatic and beloved couple, their story a modern-day fairy tale of tragedy, loyalty, and love. They had faced the storm together and had emerged stronger and more united than ever. Then, 3 months after the board meeting, on the 1-year anniversary of their bizarre wedding, Michael came home and placed a slim, leather-bound folder on the table. Natalie's heart skipped a beat. It was a divorce decree. "Our year is up," he said, his voice quiet, his expression unreadable. "Our agreement is fulfilled. You are free, Natalie." She stared at the papers, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. After everything they had been through, after all the truths they had shared, was he still holding on to the rules of their original contract? Was he really going to let her go? "Is this what you want?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It's what we agreed to," he replied, not answering her question directly. "I gave you my word that you would be free. I will not break another promise to you." He was giving her the choice, the final, most important choice. He was proving that he was not the controlling man he once was, that he would not hold her to a life she did not freely choose. She looked at the papers, at the legal jargon that would dissolve their strange, beautiful and complicated marriage. Then she looked at him, at the man who had saved her, the man she had saved in return, the man she loved more than life itself. She picked up the pen he had left on top of the folder. Her heart pounded as she signed her name on the line, the ink stark and final. The divorce was official. She pushed the papers back toward him. He looked down at her signature, and for a fraction of a second, she saw a flicker of profound, heartbreaking pain in his eyes before his mask of calm neutrality slipped back into place. "Now that our business is concluded," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I have a proposal for you, Dr. Harrington." He looked up, confused, a frown creasing his brow. She took a deep breath, her heart in her throat. She walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of him, and then she got down on one knee. "Michael Harrington," she said, her green eyes shining with a love so fierce and so certain it took his breath away. "You saved me from the worst day of my life. You gave me a family, you gave me a voice, and you gave me a love I never thought was possible. Our contract is over. So now, I'm asking for a new one." She looked up at the stunned, speechless man before her. "Marry me," she whispered, her voice full of all the love in her heart. This time for real. This time forever. Michael stared at her, kneeling before him, his brilliant mind completely, utterly short-circuited. He had prepared for every outcome, except this one. He had steeled himself for her to sign the papers and walk away, to finally claim the freedom he had promised her. He had not, in his wildest dreams, anticipated this beautiful, breathtaking role reversal. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face, a smile of such pure, unadulterated joy that it transformed him, making him look younger, lighter, happier than she had ever seen him. He reached down, taking her hands and gently pulling her to her feet. "Get up, you fool," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "The answer is yes," he murmured against her skin. 1,000 times, yes. Their second wedding was the antithesis of their first. There was no grand church, no crowd of whispering strangers. Instead, they gathered on a secluded, sun-drenched beach at sunset, surrounded by a small circle of the people who truly mattered. Natalie's father, his face beaming with pride. Michael's mother, Eleanor, her eyes soft with a genuine maternal affection for the woman who had saved her son from himself. A few close friends. That was all. Natalie didn't wear a traditional wedding gown. She wore a simple, elegant sundress that danced in the gentle ocean breeze. Michael wore linen trousers and a white shirt, his feet bare in the sand. Their vows were not improvised lines of protection and trust, but quiet, heartfelt promises whispered to each other as the waves crashed on the shore. "I promise to be your safe harbor," Michael said, his blue eyes shining as he slid a simple, beautiful wedding band onto her finger. "But the truth is, you have always been mine." "I promise to stand by your side," Natalie replied, her own voice choked with happy tears as she placed a matching band on his finger. "And there is nowhere else in the world I would ever want to be." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, for the second and final time. Their kiss was not the shocking, possessive act of a stranger, but the deep, tender, and profoundly loving embrace of two people who had found their way home. Later, at the small, intimate reception held at a nearby beach house, Michael pulled her aside. "I have a wedding gift for you," he said, a familiar, mischievous glint in his eye. He handed her a leather-bound folder. Her heart skipped a beat, a flash of memory from their first terrifying contract. She opened it cautiously. Inside, it was not a legal document. It was the deed and charter for a new, fully endowed charitable foundation. "The Leo Parker Foundation," she read, her breath catching in her throat. "It's dedicated to providing legal aid and support to the families of victims of drunk driving accidents," he explained softly. "To give them the voice that your family never had." Tears streamed down her face as she looked at him. He had transformed his guilt, their shared tragedy, into something beautiful, something that would heal others. It was the final, most perfect proof that he had turned the pain of his past into a promise for their future, a future built not on secrets, but on hope. 1 year later, Natalie stood on the podium of a brightly lit auditorium, a confident, radiant smile on her face. She was no longer the timid, out-of-place girl from the wedding. She was the executive director of the Leo Parker Foundation, a respected and powerful advocate for victims' rights. Today was the inauguration of the Foundation's first major project, a state-of-the-art rehabilitation and counseling center. She spoke with an easy, passionate eloquence, her words weaving a story of hope, resilience, and the importance of fighting for justice. In the front row, her father sat beside Eleanor Harrington, the two of them a picture of quiet, familial pride. And at the side of the stage, out of the direct spotlight, stood Michael. He watched her, not as a billionaire benefactor or a powerful husband, but simply as a man in complete and utter awe of his wife. He had seen her at her most broken, and now he was witnessing her at her most powerful, a force for good, born from the ashes of their shared tragedy. After the ceremony, as they were surrounded by well-wishers, Michael came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Leo would be so proud of you," he whispered in her ear, his voice thick with emotion. "He'd be proud of us," she corrected softly, leaning back against his chest. Later that evening, they were back in their penthouse. The grand, cold space had been transformed over the past year. It was now a home, filled with warmth, art, and the easy, comfortable clutter of a shared life. Natalie stood on the balcony, looking out at the glittering city lights. Michael came up behind her, placing a hand gently on her stomach, which was now softly, beautifully, rounded with the promise of their future. "A new legacy," he murmured, his cheek resting against her hair. She turned in his arms to face him, her green eyes shining with a love that was as deep and as vast as the night sky above them. The blonde and the redhead, the girl who was abandoned, and the man who saved her. Their story, which had started with a lie whispered in a crowded church, had become the most profound truth of their lives. "I was thinking about a name," she said, her hand covering his on her stomach. "Oh?" He smiled. "I thought we agreed on Daniel if it's a boy." We did," she said, her eyes sparkling. But if it's a girl, I was thinking of Leonora. Michael's breath caught. Leonora. A tribute to the brother who had unknowingly brought them together. He looked at his beautiful, brilliant wife, at the new life they had created, at the future stretching out before them, full of hope and healing. The circle of pain that had begun over a decade ago on a dark, rainy night had finally been closed, replaced by a new circle of love. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss filled with a gratitude so immense it was beyond words. "I love it," he whispered. "It's perfect."